How many of you were at DevDays last year and saw the workflow presentation then? If you want to go see a different one, you still can. Because not a whole lot has changed. If you want to just ask nasty questions, then you're welcome to stay. So I think we've got a couple more minutes for people to find caffeine and figure out where Muhammad is. So we'll give them that time, and we'll start probably at 9. Does anybody have any questions they want to start off? Good morning. This is FHIR Workflow. My name is Lloyd McKenzie. If you've seen the FHIR calendar, I'm one of the people who has been embarrassed by it for Renee the longest. And we've been doing HL7 for way too long, and FHIR pretty much since it started. So one of my roles within the FHIR community is I'm project lead on the FHIR Workflow project, which has been around for a little over 2 years now. And this morning I will share a little bit about what we've been up to. FHIR Workflow started after STU2 of FHIR was published. And it came about because of a number of concerns that we had with the specification. We had a couple of resources in the specification called order and order response that had people confused in terms of what they were for and how to use them. And quite frankly, we weren't quite sure ourselves. We just knew that we needed something in that space, so those were there as placeholders. we had a number of resources that were sort of doing the same kind of thing. They were all asking for something to be done, but they were designed differently. There wasn't a heck of a lot of consistency, and that lack of consistency wasn't necessarily driven by different requirements. It was driven by the fact that we had different people creating artifacts, and they thought about the same sort of problem in different ways. We also knew that we had requirements that weren't really met yet. Sometimes it's necessary to say, can you please suspend this, or can you please cancel this? And we didn't have a mechanism for communicating that, or at least not in the RESTful paradigm, which is what most people using FHIR were trying to use at that point. We didn't have a way of saying, here's a prescription. This prescription is intended to cover a year. But hey, Pharmacy X, can you please dispense a month's worth of pills? We didn't have any mechanism for doing that. We had this notion of, here's the prescription for a year's worth of supply. We didn't have any ability to say, hey, can you just do one of those, or can you just do a month's worth? And obviously that's something that's relevant in the healthcare space. And we had realized as part of DSTU2 that we needed to support this notion of proposals and plans, but we didn't have a terribly robust mechanism for doing that. We had that added in as a type of status, and the problem, of course, was that you can have plans that are on hold, and you can have orders that are on hold, and when plan is the status and you change it to on hold, you suddenly lost track of the fact that it was a plan instead of an order, and knowing which it was is kind of an important thing when you want to take it off hold. So we had some problems there, and we had a list of 7 or 8 other issues that we wanted to address. And so we said, we need a project, we're going to fix all of these things, what should we call it? And the name that we came up with was Workflow. And some people yell at us about that, saying not all of those things are workflow issues, and well, maybe they're right, but we needed to solve them, and we needed a project name, and that's what we chose. There certainly is a fair bit of workflow involved in the project, and we'll talk about what some of that involved. The project itself has been one of the more active ones within the FHIR community. We've been meeting twice a week, not quite continuously, but close, for over 2 years. And it's resulted in a new module in the specification, a new page in the specification, and 2 primary areas of focus in the specification. One is a set of patterns that we expect many of our resources to follow, more or less. We'll talk about what it means to follow a pattern. And we also have a section that talks about how do you actually ask for something to be done in FHIR. And it turns out there's a whole bunch of different ways to ask for something to be done. And there are different pros and cons to each of those. And so we have a section in the FHIR specification that talks to that, about what are the different architectural approaches to saying, hey, you please do this, and how that gets communicated and how you track progress, etc. So let's start by talking about patterns. Patterns is a concept that we introduced in release 3 of FHIR, and we only had 3 patterns at that point. We will probably have 5, maybe 6 patterns in release 4. But in release 3, we introduced 3 major patterns: definition, request, and event. And probably a little over half of the resources in the FHIR specification, we believe, fall into one of these patterns. And these patterns exist in a relationship. So you start off with a definition, which says what is possible to be done. So that might be a protocol, that might be a questionnaire, that might be an order set, but it's a description of what kind of activities are possible in the healthcare environment, or what kind of activities should be done in the healthcare environment. And you can have elaborate structures of those, so you can have protocols that contain sub-protocols that contain sub-sub-protocols. You can have replacement relationships saying we started out with protocol 1 and that's now been superseded because somebody else did a better job. And we can furthermore say that this protocol is based on this other protocol. So maybe your local college of medicine comes up with a protocol that says this is what you should do for patients who have this particular type of cancer, who fit within this gender profile or age profile or whatever, or have these genetic characteristics. And then within a particular hospital, you take that base profile and you refine it, and you create a new profile that's based on that, that's aligned with that, but that reflects what your particular team of oncologists believes is best practice, taking into account the resources that are available in your particular space. Then we have the request pattern of resources. And request covers a number of things. It covers orders. That's the primary purpose of most of our request resources, is people will use them for orders. So things like prescriptions for drugs, orders for lab tests, referrals, requests for a particular device to be provided. But we also use the request resources for proposals. So that might be a recommendation coming back from a referral. A clinician says, I think you should put them on this medication. I think you should see how that goes. If it doesn't work well, then schedule them for this kind of surgery. The difference between a recommendation and an order is sort of whether you're actually authorizing something to happen or not. With a recommendation, you're simply saying, this is something that I think ought to happen, but I'm not actually giving permission for it to happen. Somebody else has to make that call. We also, in the request space, have the notion of plans. And plans are a little bit more specific than proposals. In a plan, you're actually expressing an intention that this is going to happen. But again, you're not providing a legal authorization for it to happen. You're simply expressing an intent. And there's a whole lot more people who typically have permission to create plans for things than necessarily have permission to create orders for things. And you can have traceability between those. So you can say that this particular plan is based on this recommendation from this decision support algorithm, and this particular order is in turn based on this particular plan. And in the pharmacy world, you often have a prescriber who will write a prescription saying, I want this person to be on amoxicillin 10 milligrams, and the hospital pharmacy then says, well, actually, based on our formulary, that's going to be amoxicillin 10 milligram tablets, and take the dosage instructions that were perhaps captured as text in the order entry system and fully encode them, and create what we call an encoded order. And that's another type of request. It's still an order, but it's an order that points back to a previous order. And the nursing system might then go and create a MAR entry that says, okay, at lunchtime today, they're going to take one pill of this kind. And they will create a separate order for every single pill that particular patient is supposed to receive. And so you end up with that instance order pointing back to the encoded order, which points back to the original prescriber order, which points back to the plan, which points back to the decision support proposal, and you can have that full traceability. You don't have to. FHIR never makes you do, very rarely makes you do anything. We provide capability. So if you have a need for that traceability, the request pattern gives support for that, and if you don't need that, that's okay as well. And then finally, we have the events. These are the things that actually happen to the patient. So a drug was actually dispensed or administered, or an image was actually taken, or an appendix was actually removed, or a pair of eyeglasses was actually handed to the patient and said, here you go. And we have lots and lots of those. Within the specification, this is in the current under development version of release 4. You can see that we have a small number of definitional resources. So we typically define what can happen using a small set of things. So whether we're talking about the pharmacy world or the imaging world or planning encounters or whatever, all of that tends to be done with a relatively small number of resources. The request space, we get a little bit bigger. So things like appointments and care plans. Notice that we have non-clinical things in here as well. So a claim in the financial space is still a request. You're asking for somebody to do adjudication and hopefully provide some money. All of those are different types of request resources. And then we have the event resources. So these are things that have happened in the real world, whether that's money flowing or a patient showing up for a visit, or somebody pushing a plunger on a syringe and giving you an immunization. All of those live in the event space. Hopefully that's legible at the back. Definitional resources share a bunch of characteristics. Much of this is metadata, so things like what's the identifier for this, what's the version for this, what is it called, is this intended for real, as in this is really a protocol, or is this an experimental thing where we're saying this is more of an example, but please don't actually try to use this when you're doing patient care, because it might have been written by somebody like me, and following my recommendations for patient care is not likely to result in long lifetimes, because I'm an IT person. In addition, definitions can identify what kind of subjects can this apply to, and that might be pointing to a code that says this applies to dogs or cats or humans, or more specifically humans between the ages of 15 and 25 or something like that. We can also point to group. Group is a resource in FHIR that we use to define collections of individuals, collections of potential care recipients, typically by their characteristics. We use that in public health, we use that in research, and we also use that when we're defining protocols.
Could you speak a little bit louder?
I can absolutely try to speak a little bit louder. And if I get quiet, holler. They did not give me a mic, and this room sort of mic would have been useful. There's not a whole lot of detailed content in the definition pattern, and you'll find that's true for most patterns, because the specific content of the definition will of course vary by whether you're doing a protocol or you're doing a questionnaire or you're doing something else. But most things in this space will have metadata in terms of what is the copyright, when was this particular protocol or questionnaire or whatever last approved, when is it intended to be used, who is it intended to be used by, etc. And a number of these characteristics, such as the subject and who's intended to perform and when is it valid, will then be used when you are trying to generate your recommendations or your plans or your orders based on this definition structure. The request pattern is a little bit larger. It has a few more relationships. So we have this notion that a request can instantiate a protocol or an order set or some other kind of a definition. We have that based on relationship that lets us chain through and say this order is based on that order, which is based on that proposal. We have something called a group identifier. Within FHIR, if you have a prescription pad and you say, I want the patient to be on this medication and that medication and something else, and so you're writing orders for 3 different medications or 5 different lab tests or whatever, all on a single piece of paper and signing your name and handing that to the patient. FHIR treats that as independent actions. So each medication, each lab test is treated as a separate order because each of those things can have their own state. You might suspend one of them, you might cancel another one, and the third one continues on and remains active. And so each of those has to be a separate order instance. but it's often useful and necessary in the healthcare space to say these things were all ordered at the same time with a common identifier, because that may be relevant for billing or other workflow processes. So we use this group identifier to say, by the way, all of these things were ordered as part of a single requisition or collection. We have a status, so where is the request within its life cycle? We'll take a look at that in a bit. We have status reason. This is new as part of release 4. That lets you capture why was this thing suspended or canceled or whatever. We have the ability to differentiate whether this thing is an order or a proposal or a plan, and that's using the intent element. The intent and the state are the two elements on request that we expect to always be present, because you can't really do much with a request if you don't know whether it's complete or active, or possibly entered an error. And similarly, you can't really do much with something if you don't know if it's a proposal or if it's an order, because how you treat them is going to be dramatically different. And we don't think there are circumstances where systems are going to be passing around information and they won't know those things. We actually do allow for a status code of unknown, where you simply want to say, here's the prescription number. I have no idea if it's currently active, or even if somebody has determined that it was created by mistake. But in most we do expect you to, at minimum, declare that as I have no idea what the current state is. Number of other elements, so we can say what the relative priority of this is. We can identify what kind of request we're making. We can identify what encounter it's part of, what episode of care it's part of, when it's supposed to happen, whether that's a single time or a more sophisticated pattern, like every second Thursday for the next 3 months. We can indicate when it was created, who asked for it, who's intended to deliver it, whether that's a type of individual, so this should be done by a cardiologist, or a specific individual. I want this to be done by Dr. Smith. We can indicate why it's happening, either by code or by pointing to a patient's condition or observation or something like that. We can now capture insurance information, other supporting information. So for example, with a referral, you might make reference to past observations, past procedures, other relevant medical history, notes that have been made about this, and we can actually point to past changes. So this particular prescription was created on this date, it was suspended on this date, it was then resumed, it was suspended a couple of times, and then finally it was marked as complete. And you can point to that entire history, thank you, over the course of the request. Event is a little bit smaller. It doesn't have quite as many relationships or quite as many elements that are common. Again, it has an identifier or multiple. You can point to the protocols that the event follows. You can point to the requests or proposals or plans that it's tied to. You can have hierarchies of events. So we don't have hierarchies of requests. You can't say that this request is part of another request. But that's loud. But you can indicate that for events, because it's quite common for an encounter to be part of a larger encounter, or for a procedure to be part of a larger procedure. Again, we keep track of what the state of the event is, and what the reason for that current state is, what kind of event is happening, who the event actually happened to, so typically a patient, but not necessarily. What encounter it was part of, what episode of care it was part of, when it happened. We do allow for events that represent summaries, so it is possible to say that this patient is currently doing physiotherapy, and they're doing physiotherapy 2 times a week, and have been doing it since January. That is something that you can convey in an event. where it happened, why it's happening, and any notes. We also have the ability to indicate who's been involved in performing that particular event and what role that they had. So this was the admitting provider, this was the discharging provider, this was the author of the prescription as opposed to the verifier of the prescription, that sort of thing. Within our set of patterns, they are patterns. So these are not sort of abstract classes that we inherit from and that we follow strictly, because the reality is that in different types of resources, not all of these things are always going to be relevant. So when you're talking about an immunization, you're not generally going to have a need to say, I immunized them every Tuesday and Thursday for the last 3 months, because that's not how immunization works, and inheriting that ability wouldn't make a whole lot of sense. So, and similarly, in certain resources, there's common names like prescriber that are kind of important and business friendly that we don't want to lose. So with our patterns, we say, please look at the pattern, think about all of the elements that are in it, and figure out whether they are part of the 80%, whether they are elements that most systems would be expected to support, and if so, then try to be consistent with the names, try to be consistent with the data types, try to be consistent with the cardinality, unless you have a good reason to do something else. In some places, they may say, you know what, that can occasionally happen, but it's pretty rare and not a lot of systems support that. So yes, we will support that pattern element, but we'll do that by using a standard extension. Sometimes they'll say, yes, we'll support it, but in our domain we know it by a different name, so we'll use that different name. And certainly there will be places where the set of possible data types will be constrained. So when you're talking about something like a claim, you might be tighter in terms of some of the data types and have different constraints than when you're talking about an encounter or immunization. As per usual, the focus in FHIR is on being implementer friendly. So the way we look at it is we want it to be super easy for the people who know how to do immunizations to figure out how to use the immunization resource. The people who want to have consistency across all of the different resources because they want to treat requests in the same manner, those folks are more sophisticated and therefore more able to handle the fact that the names are a little bit different or that not everything is going to be the same in every resource, and therefore we push the complexity to those more sophisticated folks. We are looking at the possibility of generating interfaces within the reference implementations based on these patterns. Whether we'll get to that for release 4 remains to be seen. Release 4 is coming up much faster than we'd like it to be, but it's certainly on our wish list of things to happen. That won't be programmatically possible with all resources because sometimes the mapping is a little bit iffy, but where we can make that happen, that's certainly on the list of things that we would like to have happen. At the moment, the mappings to patterns are present in the mapping section of all the resources. Sometimes there will be some text there that sort of provides an explanation of how that mapping happens or some qualifications on it. We now have, as of the last couple of weeks, reports that we're providing to the different work groups saying, here is the pattern that this resource is supposed to be following, here are all the places where it's not following it. Please make sure that that's intentional. And where it's intentional, they have the ability to capture and say, yeah, we intended there to be a difference like that, so please don't bug us about it anymore. And then where it wasn't intentional, hopefully we will see alignment and we will see greater consistency with those patterns than perhaps we did in release 3. So that's the pattern side. In terms of actually asking for things to be done, let's start with a scenario. So imagine that you're a pharmacy and you've received 2 prescriptions, possibly from the same source. Both of them are for patients that frequently come to your pharmacy. Both of them have digital signatures, they're fully legal prescriptions, and in theory actionable. But only one of them is actually intended to be filled by your pharmacy. The other one's been sent to you as a for your information because it's good for you to know everything that all of the medications that patient is taking so that you can do drug-drug interaction checking, that sort of thing. And so the question for us in the workflow space is, how do we differentiate between, hey, here's a prescription, please start counting pills, as opposed to, hey, here's a prescription for your information. And it turns out that the request resource by itself isn't ideal to try to combine those two things in, because if it's been digitally signed, the pharmacy may very well want to share that prescription with somebody else. So if I say, hey, please fill this, and the please fill this is part of the prescription resource itself and it's part of the digitally signed content, then I can't take away the please fill this if I want to pass that information on to another pharmacy as a for your information. So we needed to have some way of distinguishing between please do this versus for your information that wasn't part of the digitally signed request. So the primary way that we support that in FHIR is via a resource called Task. And Task is our please do something resource. And Task can say please suspend, please create, please fulfill, please abort. And so we have the task resource that tells you what you're supposed to do and keeps track of whether it's being done or not. And the request is treated more as the authorization. So your medication request, your order or your observation request, diagnostic request, I think it's now called service request, is simply here is what should happen and here is what's authorized to happen, but it's separated out from the please do. Task resource actually adheres to both the request and the event patterns because it bridges both of those worlds. It has the ability to talk about what's desired to occur, but it also has the ability to talk about what's actually happening. So we can talk about, is this thing in progress? Has the targeted fulfiller actually agreed to do it? And where are they at in that process? So that's most clearly shown by the state machines. So in the request state machine, we have the notion of this authorization is draft. So I'm writing the prescription, but I haven't signed it yet, and you're not allowed to act upon it, at least not legally. Then we have the notion of an active authorization. So this is something that can be acted upon, and you can sometimes suspend that. So for a period of time, you're not allowed to act on it. You may be able to act on it again later. And then you either get to complete, so everything that was intended to be done by this authorization is now done, or canceled. At some point, we decided that we weren't going to finish all of the work that had been authorized, and so we stopped it. There's nothing in there about has it been requested, has it been accepted, has it been rejected, because that's not part of the authorization process, that's part of the fulfillment process. And then of course off on the right hand side we have this notion of entered an error, which is whoops, actually this thing never really existed. There was never a prescription for this patient, it would never really happen, but you might have been told that it happened, so you can keep a record of that fact. Task state machine, on the other hand, is more sophisticated. That's where we have this notion of, have you asked for it to happen? Has the intended recipient received the request, even if they haven't necessarily made a decision yet? Have they said yes or have they said no? Have they started the work? Are they sort of stopping that work? Are they finished? Did something go wrong and they weren't able to actually get to the end? So this is where you have that ability to track all of those different states. In STU2, much of this was embedded in some of the request resources. It wasn't embedded in others. In STU3 and going forward, all of this state information about where is the fulfillment process at is moved out into the task resource. Task resource is a little bit heavy in some circumstances.
You don't necessarily want to create a separate resource in order to simply say, please get this done. So we do have an ability in FHIR to put a special tag on a resource that says, hey, this is actionable. And tags are something that lives on the resource, but it lives outside the digital signature, and therefore that is a safe way of saying that something's actionable. But with tags, you don't have the ability to track state. So you don't have the ability to see, has this been received, has it been accepted, has it been rejected, is it in progress yet? You don't have any of that. So it's much more appropriate for a process where you're sort of tossing the order over the wall and saying, hey, go do this, and you trust to the filler to either they're always going to do it, they have no choice, or any exceptions to that process are going to be managed by phone call and fax and all of those other wonderful technologies that we fall back on when we don't want to have sophisticated electronic processes. But in other circumstances, if you want to let the filler say, yes, I will, or no, I won't, or maybe have the filler say, well, no, I can't do that, but I could do this instead, is that all right? To allow the placing system to see, so where are things at? Have you actually started? Am I going to get results soon? To allow the placer to say, you know what, this order that I gave you, I don't want you to do that anymore, please stop. All of those capabilities tend to require task and can be used in a number of different ways. Some of them using the RESTful paradigm, some of them using the messaging paradigm, some of them using the services paradigm to accomplish that, hey, can you please do this, and where are things at? So the second part of the workflow process, or the workflow page, is a description of what are all of these different patterns, and what are the pros and cons and capabilities of these different architectural approaches to, hey, can you get something done? And we have a very simple pattern, which is you post a request resource to the filler server, and at some point later, they post back an event that says, here you go. So I'm going to create a diagnostic order or a service order that says, do this lab test, and I post that to the lab system, and I put a little actionable flag on it, and a day later, somebody posted to my system a diagnostic report or a bunch of observations that contain the results. Very simple, lightweight process, but not a whole lot of capability. On the other hand, we have a situation like this, where you have a placing system, say an EHR. You also have a broker system that manages fulfillment. And the placer system says, hey, I have this lab order I'd like to have done. And they pass that to the broker. And the broker then is responsible for saying, hey, is there a lab out there that can get this done? And finding somebody who can actually satisfy that. Or perhaps a different example would be a referral. So I have a referral, I need this patient to be seen by a cardiologist, and the broker system is responsible for finding an eligible cardiologist who can do the work. The filler then interacts with the broker to say, yeah, I'm willing to do that, I'm going to claim that request, and then provide updates as the work gets done, finally passing the results on to the broker, that eventually will notify the placing system, the one who asked for the work to be done, to say, here is the results of that referral that you asked for. As part of Release 4, we're making a number of changes to the workflow patterns. So one of the ugly things in STU3 is that we had, in a number of places, a reference to practitioner and organization, which was a complex structure, and made a number of resources more complicated than we ideally wanted them to be. In STU4, we're pointing to practitioner role instead to serve that purpose, so the models get simpler and easier to use again. We've changed a number of the names to be a bit more implementer friendly. We've added a number of elements, including location. We've changed notion of not done to be part of the state machine, so that you can say one of the possible outcomes of an event is I didn't do the immunization. We used to have that as a separate flag, but discovered there was actually too much overlap between that and the status, and it made more sense to have it as part of the state. and we've added a number of additional resources in terms of references, what was allowed. Another thing that's changed is that we've added a new example scenario resource. Example scenario lets you document a workflow from an example perspective. So if I want to explain how a referral process works, in addition to using the plan definition resource to talk about what's permitted, it's sometimes useful to just have a real-world example of this referral got sent from system A to system B. System B said, I need more information, and sent a request and received that more information. The target system then said, yes, I agree, I'm going to do this referral. Then says, well, actually, I'm going to do it, but I'm going to do it later. Can't do it when I originally planned to. Then sends an update, here's the preliminary results, then sends an update, here's the final results, and actually see what that looks like, see what that data looks like, see what's being exchanged between the different systems, sometimes just a couple of systems, sometimes 4 or 5 or 6 different systems, and showing what that actually looks like. We have preliminary work happening working with IHE actually in rendering that content into a specification. So we actually generate these sequence diagrams. We're going to be generating some views of the actual data itself in terms of what are the resources and how do they relate to each other. So right now we've just got a flat list, but we're going to put some graphics in there as well. And so that will start to show up in implementation guides and in the core specification to give you an idea of how would you actually make pharmacy work, or how would you make lab processing work using FHIR resources and everything that exists out there. We're going to try to get all of the different request, event, and definition resources aligned with the patterns, at least as much as the work groups want them to be, and include support for example scenarios inside the specification. We have had 3 connectathons focused on workflow since we started the project, and we're going to be continuing to do that, exercising different parts of workflow. And if you're interested in doing anything workflow related at this connectathon, come talk to me, and I'd be happy to help out. We're continuing to work on improving the workflow documentation. If there are parts of it that aren't clear to you or that you think could be better, we would be happy to take feedback, and also happy to take volunteer effort in terms of providing better language. So there is no exercise for this other than go take a look at the workflow page in the specification, read through what's there, check out the patterns, see if they make sense to you, see if the documentation makes sense to you, and think about how you might use FHIR in your own space in terms of trying to ask for something to be done. Any questions?
Lloyd, I've got a question about orders. I can understand that orders may then have subcomponents, that's entirely reasonable. Is there any mechanism to explicitly state that all the subcomponents have to either happen together or not at all? So for example, if you've got medication A and medication B have both been prescribed, and one is to actually deal with side effects of medication A.
Right. So the question is there a way to, if each order is treated as a separate thing, how do you deal with circumstances where there's actually interdependencies between multiple orders and you need to say these things must happen together or this thing must happen 3 days after that thing? We have a special resource called request group. 30 seconds over. That allows you to point to a number of requests and say these things must be treated all as a group, and there's actually a special intent flag for those requests that lets them say actually this is part of something bigger and therefore it cannot have its own state. The state is managed by the request group, it's not managed by the components. So I'll be around for the rest of the 3 days. Come find me, and happy to talk workflow whenever. Thank you.